sign up for our free newsletter at pmorin.org. I will put the link in the notes below. And also consider supporting us on Patreon. We have 3 different levels. There's something there for everybody. One of the things he says towards the end of the book that really stood out to me is this quote where he's talking about our culture, right? And it really resonated. He said, "The outbursts of extreme violence that have become almost routine in our day tend to be caused not by low-level concerns such as the desire for money, but by a kind of desperation regarding the most basic questions of what existence is about and how one ought to live." In so many ways, our society does evince just a desperation, a sort of sense that we don't know how to fix the problems that we have. We're confused and fractured, and in a lot of ways desperate. Desperation is the same, carries the same root as despair. And I would say that despair is a growing attitude in our society, especially related to these types of problems and economic problems. And boy, are the two related, I've talked so much on this channel about economic precarity, which can affect people across the economic spectrum to the extent that people feel as though there is no security. I think we forget how important a sense of security is. So even people who are doing fairly well at the moment materially have come to live with a sense of deep insecurity. And of course, people who don't have the income and wealth at the moment live with it in a more palpable, direct way that affects them even more gravely. So he makes 3 points, or in effect kind of reiterates 3 points again here. He argues, first of all, there really is no such thing as private interest. We are trained to believe that there is such a thing, that we have a private interest. No one else needs to interfere in our private concerns and private life, that, other people's concerns stop at our front door, whatever that is, and that we ought to be able to pursue our interest very freely. And I think what he's observing here is that it is just it's a mythology that we're taught to think that we can do things in our quote private life that don't have all sorts of community ramifications for our family, for our friends, for our neighbors, and for the world. So in a way, we can't, he's recognizing we can't sequester anything and say this is simply private. And that means that the state of our inner self, our integrity, our soul, if you will, is of importance, not just to ourselves, which is what, the liberal order says, work out your so-called soul problems yourself, in the privacy of your own heart. You don't really need, there's no public impact there. But of course, the character and integrity and state of a person's soul, for instance, as I just discussed, whether you are in despair or not in despair, right, can lead to huge public ramifications. So it is just false that we can sequester that. He also argues that goodness makes an authoritative claim and demands public recognition. So there is a claim that goodness is something that is definable, that can be understood as of universal value. It's not just my private good as I define it versus yours, but Schindler is making the, I guess, philosophically controversial or challenging claim that there is the good. We know already that he follows the Platonic, Aristotelian, ancient position on the good. And then he makes the statement also very timely and one to really ponder. And he says that we should not be fighting these culture wars, which get us involved in these sometimes rather minute issues or issues that are really tangential to most people's lives on a daily basis, in which we basically try to destroy each other. But rather we should be rethinking our social order. We should be asking why it is that we have these culture wars, why it is that we can't stop fighting, why it is that our lives are negative and tend towards despair at times. And so that rethinking of our social order requires a concerted effort. Now, we've been trained in our culture not to make that concerted effort, not to live contemplatively at all, but completely, constantly shifting here and there, with entertainment, with information, with relationships, and so on and so forth. Our society, even in our minds, is very transient. So to rethink our social order requires concerted effort, time. So he's asking throughout this book for an attitude that an awful lot of us, if we ever had the potential, we've lost quite a bit of that potential, or it would be difficult for us to reacquire it. But I would say that this book is a call for people, and maybe especially people who say that they're serious about their Christianity or their Catholicism, since he's a Catholic thinker. He's calling especially on them to make that effort, because he would claim that the traditions, particularly of philosophy that he has expounded here, as well as the tradition that comes from the book itself, that these traditions and also political order are worth paying attention to and really learning about. And I couldn't agree with him more. I try on this channel to avoid sensationalism, and I try to deal with subjects both in a way that is understandable to lay people, but also is not just here's your 5 bullet points and hopefully you can memorize those. We all have to do better. On the issue of there being no private interest, let me explain a little bit more what he means. He's drawing here from the ancient position. And in particular, it reminds me of Plato, who argued that though many people in his ancient Greek society were aiming at what they considered to be their own good, they often did not know what their own good really was. And in fact, he said they were doing things that they thought were in their self-interest, but they were actually not, and would actually cause harm to them. Well, we know that's an experience that happens all the time. As a matter of fact, the next book I may do is Plato's Gorgias, because in that book, he really gets into that issue. We do what we think is best for us and is in our self-interest, but we actually end up backfiring. And so what that means for Plato is that in order to do what is really in our own good, we would have to have that contemplative framework. We'd have to think about it and really arrive at what is good for us first. That requires what he called philosophy, what I would call, introspection, contemplation. I don't think everybody has to be a philosopher, right, to do this, but we do have to be able to think about it and think together, because ultimately our good is tied up with others. We are social creatures, and this is another aspect of the Platonic Aristotelian position. So rightly, our good is not tied up just with our private wishes, but is tied up with the common good inevitably, because we cannot live without other people. We cannot flourish without a social life. This is just the way we're built. And so our good is defined by our social, rational, and spiritual human nature. That's how we are different from the animal kingdom, right? The rest of the animal kingdom is that we are rational creatures with the ability to speak, which allows us to think about the past, present, and future, and to do so in a much clearer way, and communally, in a much clearer, more conscious way than any other animal on the planet. And ultimately, he says, and this is where he maybe departs a little bit from Plato, but only in its Christian tinge, right? Plato argued that all persons ultimately are aiming at the good, in that they sense that they want what is good. And like I said, they're mistaken and lots of times about what that means and what they should do to get it. Okay. And Plato even argued in some of the dialogues that the source of the good was a god. He was kind of protesting against or questioning the Greek polytheism, and positing a first mover kind of God, not so much a personal God, but a first mover God. But that first mover God was the ultimate source of the good, and so was the good, right? So Schindler, in the Christian context, says, in that sense, all persons ultimately aim at God. And so therefore, that's the reason, in a nutshell, I'll go on, but like in a nutshell, that's why for Schindler, the political order and the religious order should not be and cannot be completely separated, because in his view, the political order must, to be good itself, must be creating a context in which people can become good, okay? Encourage goodness in others, more than just law abidingness, okay? He argues that goodness is authoritative. What does that mean? It means that much as Plato would have thought, once one understands the good, or at least understands it more clearly, it becomes compelling, okay? So we have this view in our modern society that we have all these options and choices, right? But to the extent that they don't match up with true goodness, they are actually harmful, okay? So we live in this mental space where everything is an option and is subjective. And Schindler is coming from the Platonic position that no, everything is not subjective. There is an objective good. And our job and the job of authority figures ought to be to lead us towards that, okay? If we choose without recognizing an objective goodness, then we are irrationally granting value to something. And that leads partly to the despair I'm talking about, because when you wake up in the morning and you're living with your choices, but you have no reason to tell yourself as to why you've made those choices that's defensible even to yourself, let alone to others, or you feel like you can't really defend them. You just have to assert them and say, this is my choice. You have your own. It's empty. It leads, whether you're conscious of it or not, to a sense that that your life is meaningless because you cannot supply it with meaning. So this is why he argues objective good calls for public recognition by its nature. We're social beings. If there is a good that's objective that we should be aiming at, then it should be recognized publicly. Okay, so of course the devil is in the details, but he says goodness is essentially authoritative. To allow ultimate goodness only in a private form is to make it something other than good. And like I said, this is something that I'm adding, but it leads to that sense of despair that he talks about in that first quote. I mean, this is the linkage that he's trying to make in his own words. He says goodness represents a kind of authority rather than a kind of power. So here he's he's distinguishing authority and power, okay? Power, it can make you do something through coercive force, but it can't make you want to do that. It can't make you necessarily recognize, in order for you to recognize an authority, you have to accept the authority's reasons, right? Or at least you have to accept that the authority understands the reasons themselves and that those reasons are good. He says goodness represents a kind of authority rather than a kind of power. What it imposes is the truth about itself, which is precisely that in relation to which choices are made and decisions are enacted. Now, contrast that with the liberal approach, he says, where the public recognition of the truth of a particular good is legally prohibited in the name of private rights. So we can't really have a public discussion that's truly public. I mean, we can have lots of free speech, and that's great, where everybody is sort of speaking their truth, right? But what we can't have is a truly public conversation that leads to a public consensus. Now, I'm dubious as to whether this is possible, even if we tried at this point, but hopefully you understand the distinction he's trying to make. There's some things missing from Schindler's argument, which I just want to point out briefly, but I think that they could be incorporated, and I'd like to do that over time myself in my own thinking. But missing largely is an understanding of the mechanisms of capitalism and the role of capitalism in the problem. In capitalism, we get the collective good of healthy nature, as he might put it, that is denied by the collective right to growing material wealth. Growing material wealth supersedes any other societal priorities. It's the one thing that everybody is supposed to agree on. The ideology of capitalism says, if you participate in this economy, which, by the way, you have to do, you really don't have a choice, then you will achieve the collective good of material prosperity. A rising tide lifts all boats. That is the one claim. But capitalism feeds off of the diversity of all the other claims, right, to goods, to private goods. The more, the better. The multiplicity of lifestyles, the multiplicity of values, the multiplicity of goods in people's minds leads to endless markets for products and services and so forth. So to not factor in the effects of capitalism in a frontal way is a bit missing here. And it's something that could easily be done by others. And I would encourage people to do that. And I certainly plan on trying to integrate, Schindler's ideas with our own on capitalism. This point that he makes really resonated with me because long ago I read Martin Diamond's essay, Ethics and Politics, The American Way. Diamond was a Straussian who applied that frame of thinking to the American situation and asked, the critical question about sort of bourgeois liberal right and whether it was good enough in light of the framework of comparison between ancient natural right and modern natural right. And his answer was that it was not good enough, and yet it was, in a way, the best that could be done, at least now. It's an interesting piece, and I would encourage everybody to read it. Schindler says that liberal ideology aims at keeping the peace amongst all these disparate, individual and, interest group claims to subjective goodness. But it misses the fact that true peace comes with a settlement on a higher end. In other words, true peace comes from societal agreement. Okay, now the liberal would say, well, we have the agreement to disagree. That's not working out too well, I have to say. So, the phrase that you sometimes hear in our culture, no justice, no peace. One interpretation of that is that, until we all agree on what justice is, we can't really have peace. We can only have a truce. Okay. So that's a kind of faint reflection of what Schindler would be talking about here, right? True peace comes with a settlement on a higher end that society can kind of converge on. Again, it's hard to imagine this happening, but on the other hand, he does have a point, right? That at least convergence on basic values would lead to more peace. If people not only agreed intellectually, but also in their actions. It's hard to deny the truth of that statement. And furthermore, kind of like Martin Diamond, Schindler argues that in effect, even though liberal states claim to be value neutral in a way to allow individuals to pursue whatever interests and values they embrace, every community actually does have some definition of the good. It's just a question of whether that good is actually good. You know, in the case of the United States, perhaps in our community, this means individual freedom. But from a perspective such as Diamond's or Schindler's, the idea of saying that individual good is our collective good is to say that we have no collective good, that it's empty, that it's kind of like a void to be filled with whatever. It dodges the question. So this neutrality is in effect an answer to the definition of the good. The good is, in this case, literally a sort of void or emptiness, which can be filled with anything. So thinkers like this would simply say that's not good enough. It doesn't lead to true peace. It creates conflict. It creates disorder and despair.